The moment Bill Maher went after NPR on live television, it didn't feel like a calculated ambush or a partisan hit job. It felt more like a slow-burning frustration finally boiling over. Maher, who has spent decades comfortably orbiting the Democratic Party and its cultural ecosystem, wasn't speaking as an outsider, trying to score points. He was speaking as someone who had watched an institution he once respected drift into something unrecognizable. And when he said it out loud, bluntly, and without apology, it landed harder precisely because of who he is and where he comes from. It started almost humorously, with Maher referencing his own last name, and the irony that Katherine Maher, a former head of NPR, shared it. She had confidently declared NPR to be completely unbiased, a claim Maher dismissed instantly, not with anger but with incredulous disbelief. "Give me a break," he said, capturing in 5 words what many listeners have felt for years. This wasn't about minor editorial slants or subtle framing. Maher was accusing NPR of something far more damaging: self-deception. In his view, NPR wasn't just biased. It was so deeply embedded in a particular ideological worldview that it no longer even recognized its own leanings, let alone acknowledged them honestly to its audience. What made the exchange so striking was that Maher wasn't echoing conservative talking points. Republicans have been criticizing NPR for decades, often reflexively. This was different. This was a critique coming from someone who listens to NPR, who grew up with it playing in the background, who once saw it as a serious, intellectually honest institution. Maher wasn't celebrating its potential downfall. Sounded almost disappointed, like someone watching a trusted friend slowly lose touch with reality. While insisting nothing had changed, the broader context only heightened the tension. PB and NPR were under scrutiny in Congress, facing renewed accusations of liberal bias and questions about whether taxpayer dollars should continue flowing to public broadcasters. Historically, Maher might have brushed off such attacks as predictable Republican hostility to our public media. But this time, he didn't. Instead, he leaned into the criticism, arguing that the entire premise of government-funded media no longer made sense in an era this polarized. Maher pointed out something fundamental that often gets overlooked. Public broadcasting emerged in a time when political disagreement existed, but mutual legitimacy remained intact. Democrats and Republicans didn't view each other as existential threats. There was still a shared civic space where institutions like NPR could plausibly claim to serve a general audience. That world, Maher argued, is gone. Today's media environment is defined by tribalism, suspicion, and ideological warfare. In that climate, the idea of a taxpayer-funded outlet claiming neutrality while clearly resonating with one side of the political spectrum feels increasingly untenable. The problem, as Maher framed it, wasn't that NPR had a point of view. Everyone does. The problem was that NPR continued to insist it didn't. That insistence, he suggested, was insulting to listeners' intelligence. Audiences aren't stupid. They can hear the patterns, the language, the assumptions baked into coverage. When an outlet repeatedly frames stories through the same moral lens, highlights certain grievances while minimizing others, adopts activist terminology as if it were neutral fact, people notice. When the outlet then declares itself unbiased, it creates a credibility gap that no amount of earnest tone can bridge. This critique was echoed by others on the panel, including former NPR insiders who spoke with a mixture of affection and disillusionment. One guest described a lifelong relationship with NPR, stretching back to childhood car rides with parents listening to the station religiously. For decades, NPR had been a trusted companion, a place for thoughtful reporting and broad-based storytelling. But something changed, especially after 2020. The guest recalled a moment that crystallized the shift: his young daughter, barely old enough to understand politics, asking from the back seat why NPR always seemed to be playing the same thing. She didn't have the vocabulary to articulate media bias or ideological framing, but she sensed repetition, sameness, a constant focus on grievance and limitation. Stories about who couldn't do what, who was oppressed, who was harmed, who was excluded. What struck her father wasn't just the observation itself, but that a child without context could feel it. To him, that was proof that NPR had narrowed. its lens so dramatically that even a casual listener could detect it. This wasn't nostalgia talking. It was a recognition that NPR had shifted from being a general audience institution to one that increasingly spoke to a specific, highly educated, culturally progressive demographic. That audience might still be large, but it is not universal. And when a publicly funded outlet begins to feel like it's catering to a niche worldview, the question of funding becomes unavoidable. Maher's argument for privatization flowed naturally from this realization. If NPR truly believes in its editorial direction, then it should stand on its own, just like Fox News or MSNBC. Those networks don't pretend to represent everyone. Their audiences understand the perspective they're getting, and they opt in accordingly. NPR, by contrast, still wraps itself in the language of public service and neutrality while accepting taxpayer money from people who may feel actively misrepresented or alienated by its coverage. Privatization, in Maher's view, wouldn't destroy NPR. It would liberate it from a contradiction. Free from public funding, NPR could be as ideological or as opinionated as it wants without pretending to speak for the entire nation. And if its content truly resonates, audiences would support it voluntarily. If not, that too would be an honest outcome. The conversation then turned to specific examples. Moments where NPR's editorial choices seemed to cross from interpretation into distortion. One of the most glaring involved coverage of comedian Dave Chappelle. Chappelle's comedy specials had ignited fierce controversy, particularly among activist circles upset by his jokes about gender identity. The backlash was swift and loud, with calls for cancellation and moral condemnation flooding social media. NPR's role in that controversy raised eyebrows, especially when critics noticed how the outlet framed the response. A critical review gave Chappelle's special a low score, emphasizing elite disapproval and activist outrage. Absent from the coverage was the overwhelming audience reaction. On platforms like Rotten Tomatoes, viewers rated the same special extremely highly, reflecting broad public appreciation that sharply contradicted critical opinion. To Maher, that omission wasn't accidental, it was illustrative. Critical voices aligned with a particular cultural perspective in minimizing the reaction of millions of ordinary viewers. NPR wasn't merely reporting on a controversy. It was subtly instructing its audience on how to feel about it. This wasn't neutral journalism, it was cultural arbitration. Maher contrasted this with the way comedy has traditionally been understood. Comedians don't invent social tensions. They expose them, exaggerate them, and force audiences to confront uncomfortable truths through humor. Chappelle's work, Maher argued, was filled with irony, self-awareness, and personal experience, including his friendship with a trans comedian. Reducing it to a checklist of offensive statements, stripped it of context and complexity, turning layered storytelling into a morality play. This flattening of nuance, Maher suggested, is a hallmark of activist-driven media coverage. Everything must be read literally. Irony is erased. Intent is ignored. What matters is whether a piece of content can be slotted into a predefined framework of harm and oppression. In that framework, audiences aren't trusted to think critically. They're guided toward approved conclusions. The moment that truly crystallized Maher's frustration came when he read aloud an NPR line suggesting that Dave Chappelle was using white privilege to excuse homophobia and transphobia. Maher's reaction wasn't just disbelief, it was almost incredulous laughter. Dave Chappelle, one of the most prominent black comedians in America, framed as wielding white privilege. To Maher, this wasn't just a bad take, it was ideological language run amok, applied so mechanically that it no longer made sense. More than anything else, was why Maher believed defunding NPR was justified.